Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first podcast of Forum Historia, a little YouTube channel that my friend Philip and I have started. My
Hello
name's
there.
Matt, by the way.
I'm Philip.
Clearly. And we've decided to do this because we're two undergraduate history students, and we thought, what's something that's kind of missing a bit from YouTube?
And another podcast is what we need.
Exactly. And so that's why we decided to do this today. For today's specific topic and our first sort of introductory topic.
Should we do a drum roll, just in case everyone didn't watch that cute little introductory video that you did?
I mean, you can if you want.
It is.
It's the Byzantine Identity.
Oh, how exciting.
I know, it just rolls off the tongue, does it not?
Well, because for the next few episodes, Matthew has decided that the topic we'll be doing is all about Byzantium, which I think is pretty groovy, if I do have to say so myself.
I mean, I do also, and it's a good few thousand years to cover, so, we've got
Quite a lot.
plenty of time to work on those, so...
But yeah, the main point is that over the next few weeks, we'll just pick episodes, pick topics that we want, whatever piques our interest.
Yep.
I know Matthew is very excited for the episode when we get on to Corvinus.
Yep.
Look at the glee-ridden smirk that is on his face right now.
The good old Renaissance king of Hungary.
But myself, when we get to Augustus, I mean, you might as well just not talk, Matthew. I think
fine.
it will roll off the tongue.
It's less work for me to do, so...
My dear Augustus.
Yeah.
So, Byzantium.
Yep.
Tell me about it, Matthew. What is it?
So, just a quick kind of introduction for Byzantium in case, people watching don't
Watching.
people listening,
listening.
whatever it is, however we decide to upload this, But yeah, for those listening, essentially Byzantium originally was a small city created by...
It was Megara. So
yeah.
back... I think it was during the Greek Bronze Age, you have a lot of colonies being sent out. And tiny little Megara, just south of Athens on the Peloponnese, sends out this colony. And, of course, a fun time. It involves the Oracle of Delphi. Mm-hmm. And the Oracle says, oh, you should build a city where the blind man lives. And, what does that mean, Matthew? Where does the blind man live?
Apparently in Byzantium.
But what was his name? Byzos, that's it. He sees this perfect spot of uninhabited land just across the Bosphorus from Nicomedia. And he says, well, these people are blind for the fact that they have built their city on the wrong side of the Bosphorus. And that is how the city founds. And it has quite an interesting history, pre-Constantine, to be honest.
But speaking of Constantine, so the Roman Empire, which I'm sure everybody's at least heard of once.
What's the Roman Empire, Matt?
It's an empire that we're not talking about today. Oh, what a shame.
But we are talking about it, technically.
A little bit.
Technically.
But essentially, so Romans from the city of Rome, they expand their empire quite far, all the way, in this case, to the
Some
Bosphorus.
could say they went a Roman.
A little bit. That was a trash joke, though.
Ooh.
But yeah, so they expanded their empire quite far, and in this case, as far as the city of Byzantium.
They come into contact with the Greek-speaking East fairly soon, really.
Mm-hmm.
Just from the Macedonian Wars, the Seleucid Wars, they come and they just see this perfect harbour. But
Yep.
they forget about it and do nothing about it.
Until, in the 300s, we have, good old Constantine the Great that comes along, and he decides to take this city of Byzantium and create a marvelous city, a bustling metropolis.
In true Roman fashion, it comes about because of civil war.
Of course.
The constant theme of every single episode is civil war.
But I guess that's a story for another time. But the point is that he creates the city, he names it after himself, Constantine, and, Constantinople as it becomes known. And as time goes on, the Roman Empire essentially splits into two, the Eastern and Western Roman Empires, Byzantium being the Eastern Roman Empire, and Constantinople becomes the capital of it. And the Western Roman Empire, it falls. It
pitter-patters away.
Yeah, it disappears
Little
from
child
history.
emperor. Goodbye, Romulus.
Yeah, quite a sad story, which is another one that we might end up doing at some point. But Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, whatever you want to call it, it continues on, and it continues on all the way till 1453, where it itself is eventually conquered and ends. But essentially, for the topic of today, what we're talking about is that Eastern Roman Empire and sort of their identity and how it kind of
How
changes.
they viewed themselves and
how the West also viewed them, and that sort of thing.
yeah. So basically, Matthew and I have been talking, and we've really come down that there are three pillars of Byzantine identity. You've got the city itself,
That of Constantinople. Yep.
I mean, wow. Then you've got the emperor. So the continuous succession from Augustus, my man, all the way to Constantine the 11th, 1,500 years later. And then the big one, I think, is the religious orthodoxy, that being their Christianity, Greek Orthodoxy, whatever you want to call it. So let's start with the city itself. Matthew, tell me about the city.
So, as we mentioned, the city of Constantinople, it wasn't constructed by Constantine the Great, but it was expanded by Constantine the Great, and he essentially turned it.
It was refounded.
It's refounded, yeah, it's a good way of putting it. And he essentially took this sort of crappy place that nobody really wanted to be to, and he really made it, for a long time, the center of pretty much the world, or the center of the Roman world at least. And the city itself, it means more to Byzantium than just a capital or a city. From their point of view, Constantinople is essentially heaven on earth.
It's their homeland.
It's their homeland. God himself has come and, bestowed powers in Constantine the Great to essentially make heaven on earth.
Exactly. Because the whole purpose of the refounding was to have a Christian capital, because Rome, naturally enough, having thousands of years prior, is full of pagan temples. The same with every single other Roman capital at the time. You've got Milan, Sirmium, Antioch. They're just pagan to the bustling. And then you have Constantinople, refounded, just smack bang this huge church, not a single pagan in sight. It is pure and Christian.
Essentially, yeah. And so it holds quite a profound place in the identity of the Byzantines, right? Because without their city, they essentially, to them, are no one.
Exactly. There's no empire.
Yeah, because a good way, I read in a book recently, which the name of is escaping me, but essentially to the Byzantines, Constantinople is Rome, right?
Well, the city itself is called New Rome.
Correct, yeah. And so, the city is Rome, and so if the Roman Empire is to once again expand and become, what it was, it will happen from Constantinople, not from the city of Rome itself.
Because even when Justinian reconquers Rome, reconquers the whole of Italy and Africa, the capital still stays in the east.
Correct.
It is the new capital. There is no moving around. And then once you were saying you have that quote from Nikitas Koinades on how beautiful the city is.
Yeah, so there's this... So just briefly, Nikitas Koinades, he's a writer in the early 1200s. He's a Byzantine writer.
A busy boy.
A little bit. And he has this nice quote here, which kind of shows sort of what the city of Constantinople kind of means to the Byzantines. And it's a bit of a lament because he's writing about, the fall of Constantinople in 1204. But it essentially goes like this. O city, city, eye of all cities, universal boast, supermundane wonder, the abode of everything good. So essentially...
Beautiful Greek accent.
Oh, well, I wasn't trying. But what he's trying to say essentially is that, this city, it is the world, right? So, to the Byzantines, they are at this point Roman. They consider themselves to be Roman, and really you could use the word Roman as being, the same as sort of human, right? They consider themselves the human race, and everybody else is just a barbarian who is wrong in the eyes of God, essentially, and shouldn't, exist or whatever, or just there doing their own thing. They're not part of the world.
Exactly, the barbaroi, as they say.
Mm-hmm.
And once you mentioned 1204 and the Fourth Crusade, because once you get to post 1204 and you have these successor states, or rump states, we should say, the Despotate of Epirus, the Empire of Trebizond, and the really important one, Nicaea, you lose this Roman identity. You get this limping along, and you find that the Emperor Michael Paleologos just is a tiny rump state of itself. There is no Roman Empire because they have lost. The throne is vacant, essentially.
Essentially, yeah. So, they've lost their city, and so therefore they start to not really see themselves as Roman anymore.
No, you find this, they become more Hellenized. There's this really interesting thing that I read about the other day, that onwards you get this resurgence of learning that, interestingly enough, even women at the time in Nicaea were just as educated as the men. And you get this huge, almost like a renaissance of Hellenism being copied, brought back, and you just find, even in the artwork of Nicaea, that it just becomes incredibly Greek, that the mosaics are more Hellenic than they are Roman in their figurines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This sort of idea of becoming more Greek, after 1204, we'll return to that a little bit later on. But, in the meantime, the sort of reason why Constantinople really is so important in this sense is because, to be Roman in their eyes, or, a part of the empire, you need to essentially be in some way connected to Constantinople, right? So, you might not be a citizen of Constantinople necessarily, but if you're living out in the countryside, wherever it may be, you're still under the direct influence of Constantinople, as well as the emperor and the empire itself, which is kind of our next topic that we're going on to.
Which I just find this so funny, how despite it being such a similarity, it's so different to the Augustan period, where to be a Roman, you have to be a Latin speaker with citizenship. And here we are, thousands of years later, it becomes solely based on the city itself. There's never really a mention of citizenship, because you get people coming up who are Armenians, Georgians, Bulgarians,
even Latin Westerners as well.
Becoming Roman emperors. I mean, even the famous Heraclius is supposedly the son of an Armenian.
Yeah, and I think that works quite well into our next point, which is that, another large component of their identity is the emperor, the idea of having an emperor and an empire, because they didn't particularly. So take, for example, the city of Rome, after the fall of the West, and how the Holy Roman Empire, for example, starts to form, and the papacy in Italy as well. They didn't see them as Romans from a Byzantine perspective.
Oh no, the Byzantines just viewed them as horrible squatters taking over.
Yeah, the idea of them being squatters is quite profound, because they're squatters not because they were Westerners. They were squatters because they weren't subservient to the emperor.
And they weren't Romans.
Correct. And they weren't Romans because they weren't subservient to the emperor and the empire and things like that. Because, as you said, the empire was ethnically diverse, Armenians and Greeks and, whatever it is.
Exactly.
But you are only a part of the empire if you were subservient to that emperor. And so in that way, we can see our first sort of point of how the emperor really forms its own sort of pillar of
He becomes
Byzantine
the anchor
identity.
of the empire, essentially.
yeah.
That you can lose your Latinness, you can lose your religiosity, but without an emperor itself. That's why when you have these Latin emperors they're just kings. That's the empire just fragments away without this strong central authority.
Yeah, very much so. And the emperors themselves, they have quite a lot of roles within the sort of idea of Byzantium, and this again why they have such a high importance in the Byzantine identity. And the first and foremost is obviously being in defense of the empire, and specifically Constantinople more than anything. And again, we can see that quite well from Corneatus, the ancient writer we were talking about before, because essentially in his annals that he writes about the sack of Constantinople in 1204, he essentially bombasts the emperors that are involved, right? So
all 5 of them.
a lot of them.
Oh, this sack, it's something.
It's a topic of its own, I feel. But he bombasts them because they failed to enact their duty, right? Which is essentially to defend the realm, to defend the empire and what the empire stands for, which in this case is Constantinople.
And that's why the emperor itself, as a position, is essentially a military one.
But yeah, so they had their role was to defend Constantinople and to defend the empire and things like that. And it's not just for reasons of defending the realm in the same way that say like the English king is there and is tasked with defending the English realm. It's more that because, as we mentioned, the city itself is from their perspective God's heaven put on earth. It's also a religious role as well.
Oh yeah, you get this term that comes up during later historiography, Caesaropapism.
Yeah.
Where the emperor is head of the church, but subservient to God and the bishops.
Yeah, very much so. So, in the ways that we see, Western kings, and a lot of times, people tend to elect the king in dire situations and things like that through, like a royal diet, for example.
Oh yeah, especially in your Hungary.
In Hungary, which will, again, it's a topic for another time. But in Byzantium, it doesn't happen in the same way because the power isn't given to the emperor from the people.
No.
It's from God himself specifically.
There's only a few cases we have in Byzantium, and these are really dire situations. Essentially, the sack again.
Yeah.
Why does everything come back to the sack?
It's just sadness on earth.
The Senate of Byzantium electing an emperor, much like what the Senate of Rome would have done centuries before. But this is not the norm. It is always from God.
Yeah.
Birthrights, military rights, just anything but popular consent.
Yeah, pretty much. But from their perspective, the reason for that is because this is the city of God in their eyes, and so therefore the only one that owns it and can really give charge of its defense and its administering and things like that is God.
Exactly.
And so in that way, the emperors are really the sort of heralds of the Orthodox Christian Church in this case.
And I think the most important thing about the emperor, which I can't believe we haven't mentioned yet, is that it is essentially an unbroken line of succession. And basically the government form is exactly the same as Diocletian, which is a Roman of the Romans, good Roman bread.
As opposed to an Eastern Roman. Which is...
That's just adding a bit of HBO Rome into the mix. And the theme system that you get basically matches the diocese system of Diocletian. And as I said before, there's a Senate, there's an emperor, the army. There's essentially a pseudo-praetorian guard that you get with the Scholae Palatini, just any form of imperial guard, court life. The emperor is unbroken from real Rome, I may say.
Yeah, I mean, and speaking of that unbroken sort of lineage from the Roman emperors, I think we can really see how to the ordinary Byzantine, the emperor really played that profound role in their identity because again going back to Corneatus, even though he savages the emperors essentially for being terrible and not doing their job or anything like that, at no point in his annals does he actually advocate for the removal of the emperors or anything, or the the institution of the emperor. And go back to say, the Republic of Rome.
Yeah, Republican sentiment has long died.
Yeah, so
and you have to remember that to the average person on the street that doesn't really have an idea of the outside world. These are, by essence, uneducated, middle-aged peasants. All they see is the propaganda, the emperor, the image that's portrayed.
Yeah. Definitely, and that's that's again why sort of the emperor was so so big, I guess, in this period.
The real anchor of the system.
The real anchor of the system, because it was the figurehead of everything, of the system itself.
Of the system. All you had to do was look at a coin, and even if you can't read it, a lot of Byzantine coins will have an image of Jesus, particularly in the 7th century. And then they will have a picture of the emperor next to him, or the emperor and his son, depending on which particular dynasty we're talking about. And it's always, again, this connection to orthodoxy, religion, Jesus, all of that.
Which, speaking of, the sort of orthodox...
That's a great segue.
Yeah, I thought so too. But speaking of religion and orthodoxy and all that kind of stuff... in our little story that we're weaving to you today, the third sort of pillar of the Byzantine identity really comes from the Orthodox Church itself, if you'd like to talk about it.
The big shabam, yes. This religion, I think, in any sort of context is important. I mean, these are people that still believe in demons and spiritual energy. Just they haven't really gone through the Renaissance and the birth of atheism.
Sadly, they never will either.
No, it's basically impossible for them to conceive a world without divine intervention. So it comes basically down to this distinct Roman view on how they have the relationship with the gods. You have, under the Augustan period, I will always mention Augustus at every single point, of course, you have this Pax Deorum, which is peace of the gods, and it basically says that while ever good religious tidings are met, the empire will survive. So when you have periods of instability or bad emperors, famine, it is always down to the average person, what have we done wrong? Even when it was the small city-state of Rome and you had these bad omens, and you'd go through house to house to house to house. Oh, have you not done the proper sacrifices? Have you not done this correctly? And so this carries on into the Christian period. So you have these immense church discussions, the Council of Chalcedon, the Council of Nicaea, trying to work out with this new Christian faith what the nature of God is. And so it becomes important to the Byzantines to really focus on what is our orthodoxy. And at the time, there's this thing called the Pentarchy, which is the 5 cities. So that is Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. And these are, for various reasons, the most important religious centers. I mean, Rome, because Peter or Paul was... St. Peter's in Rome. St. Peter goes to Rome. Constantinople, just because of Constantine. Otherwise, it's got no religious importance.
Yeah.
Antioch is because that was where the first Christians started referring to themselves as Christians. Jerusalem is a bit too obvious. Where do we begin?
Yeah.
And then Alexandria is because it's essentially the second most important city. And there was, I think it was St. Thomas, or one of the apostles went to Alexandria as well. So these 5 archbishops, whatever you want. Pentarchs, yeah, become the center of church debates over the meaning of God. And these arguments, gosh, I mean, Santa Claus, St. Nicholas, as it's coming up to Christmas, is not the sweet old jolly man that you think he is. You get St. Nicholas going up to Arian, who is a heretic by all standards. Arianism is long dead. Just thwopping the man face flat in the ground, in the middle, right in front of, I think it was Constantine, just smashing him, saying, "I have no time for pagan heretics. This is beneath me." And, of course, getting excommunicated for it. But really driving home an important thing on where religion is important in Byzantium. Do you have any...
Yeah, so to sort of carry on from that and the sort of pentarchy that we were talking about, the pentarchy itself is innately important into the Byzantine identity because, as we mentioned, those cities were in some way related religiously to Christianity and by extension to Byzantium or to Rome as they saw themselves. And so, again, if you weren't Orthodox, you weren't Roman.
Which became a real problem just before the Arab invasions in Syria and Egypt, because a lot of these archbishops would subscribe to their own viewpoints. So in the local ministry, you'd get a lot of Monophysites and Arians that would essentially be disrespectful to the imperial orthodoxy, depending on which way we went. Because not all emperors were Orthodox. You have, I think, Anastasius, who was an Arian, and even Constantine himself, the great man, is often forgotten that he was, up until his death, an Arian.
Because, at the time, that was considered the correct form of Christianity.
That was orthodoxy.
Yeah, essentially.
It is constantly changing.
Essentially, yeah.
But we eventually pinpoint down Chalcedonian orthodoxy.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, it's the Arab invasions that are the biggest boost to Christianity, not any church council at all, I find. What I read was that with the Arab invasions, all these Syrian and Egyptian heretics, I'll call them heretics. It's mean, I know, but they are people.
But it's how Byzantium would have seen them. So
exactly, we are Romans after all. They're essentially cut off from the empire. They become absorbed into this new Islamic empire, and each part views itself as Orthodox. Orthodox being the what would you say?
Overarching term.
The overarching term, not for any distinctive. This is capital O Orthodox, not little o.
Yeah.
If we're talking grammatically. And so because the empire consolidates into the Orthodox heartland in Anatolia and Greece, it essentially allows for there to be no dissenting voices in church councils, in church politics. There is only orthodoxy. And that becomes, from the 600s onwards, the way that the empire religiously views itself. Essentially like biblical Israel under siege, the chosen ones. Yeah,
and it's, orthodoxy, to follow the sort of thread that we've been sort of weaving so far, the fact that Western Europe and in particular the papacy of Rome, is from a Byzantine perspective not considered Roman.
Oh yeah.
As we mentioned before, it's because they're not subservient to the emperor, but they're also not Orthodox Christians.
No, they develop very quickly soon after with the Goths and Vandals. They go along, the Catholic line. The papacy of Rome essentially asserts itself as preeminent above the emperor. And this is hundreds of years of problems coming up.
Pretty much. But as a result of that, from a Byzantine perspective, because they're not Orthodox, because they're not subservient to the emperor, they're not Roman.
No.
They hold Rome. They consider themselves the extension of Rome after it fell.
The diminutive Latins.
Exactly. And so exactly. So because they're not Roman, they're just called Latins or
with
barbarians even. Yeah, so, we've got a bit of a war of words going there.
The pen is mightier than the sword, as they say.
Apparently so. But that sort of flows us on very nicely onto our next topic, which is sort of how the Western world viewed Byzantium.
Oh, yeah. They don't like Byzantium, really.
No.
The poor Byzantium, beleaguered state that it is just constantly beset by bitchy little Western powers.
But to be fair, as we mentioned there, even the Holy Roman Empire is denoted as just being Latin, or the Franks or whatever it is.
So it should be.
But yeah, so from both perspectives, they're purposefully throwing shade essentially at each other. But yeah, so for this particular topic, we have two kind of really good sort of French sources about this from, again, the sack of Constantinople in 1204, sorry.
Will it always come back to the sack? Wow,
yeah.
It's always the sack.
It always goes back because it's quite a pivotal moment in Byzantine history, unfortunately. But sort of the first one we have is a sort of lower noble called Robert of Clary. He's obviously a Frenchman, and he participated in the sack of Constantinople. And throughout his accounts, we can see how Byzantium, from a Western perspective, is not part of Europe. It's not really part of any sort of community that the Catholics are a part of. Essentially,
it only mingles, only slightly mingles. There's a few marriage alliances, but nothing substantial.
No, they're not really considered to be in the same community. It's sort of us and them. We are the true Christians, and they're those heretics over there. In the same way that Byzantium sees it back, essentially. And so in both of these particular sources, the second one being Villehardouin's Chronicle, another French nobleman, but a high noble.
It's making me wish I paid attention in Year 8 French, I think.
A little bit, because I don't know how to pronounce his name.
For those at home, it is Villehardouin. If you're interested.
If you're French and you know how to pronounce that, please let us know.
Please let us know. Or Quebec. I'm happy for a French Canadian, just as long as you speak French.
As long as you have the pronunciation, I suppose, yeah.
Of us bloody Australians that can't pronounce anything.
French words. But yeah, so in both of these particular chronicles, and obviously in plenty of other Western sources, the common idea was to refer to Byzantium as Greeks, as being the Greeks.
Emperor of the Greeks.
And this leads us to some pretty mean discussions, I suppose you could say, between the two sides.
Jaded pens.
Yeah, some jaded pens. So for example, there's a story of in 968 of the Emperor Nikephoros Phorkos, who's a Byzantine emperor, and he's being treated by Otto the Great of Germany, and his Otto's heralds essentially proclaim Nikephoros as being, the emperor of the Greeks.
Behold,
Right? Not
Imperator Grecorum.
yeah, not emperor of the Romans, which is obviously a pretty massive insult. And so, this leads
Just a slight insult, Matthew.
just a little bit. Yeah, because, again, going back, to be Roman meant that you were essentially part of humanity.
There's no such thing as dual citizenship.
Essentially, in this
You're
time.
either Greek or Roman, never both.
Yeah. But essentially, so Nikephoros, he savages back, and he essentially just, he complains by saying that, Otto is a mere barbarian king who had no conceivable right to call himself either Roman nor an emperor. Pretty savage words going on.
Hello, Voltaire. How do you do?
Yeah.
Not holy, not Roman, and dare I say, not an empire.
It's, again, another topic for another time. But the memes were appreciated. but
That's a shout out to Roman SVQR posting, by the way.
But yeah, so we can see that, obviously this is a quite profound insult.
It's a very sensitive nerve.
Yeah.
If you kind of poke the emperor, you just want to get a response. All you have to do is say, "You're the emperor of the Greeks," and it just blows up.
Yeah.
Until once again the sack, and you get poor Michael VIII.
Yeah.
And who was he talking to?
So Michael VIII, Paleologus, he essentially, 40 years before, something like that, essentially the sack of 1204, they lost Constantinople, and he became eventually the emperor of Nicaea, which formed in the place of Byzantine Empire. And he was the one to eventually reclaim Constantinople for the Byzantine Empire and re-establish the Byzantine Empire. But essentially, Michael VIII often is called Emperor of the Greeks, as was all of the emperors, essentially. And he made no protest against it.
No, he just accepted it.
He just accepted
down, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But they were in such a weak position that he needed money. He basically, it was a ruined city, a empire that had lost its empire. And so he would accept anything. He was...
Yeah.
Because the interesting thing is the title of the emperors itself, they're supposed to be Augustus. And then once we get to Heraclius, they're called Basileus. Again, if you're Greek, please tell me the correct pronunciation. And then they eventually start being called Autocrator. So you have this, there's no Latinness about it, essentially. So one could be forgiven for thinking these are Greeks.
But I think this works quite nicely into our next topic, which is sort of how the Byzantine identity has really changed. And it changed mostly after the sack of Constantinople in 1204.
The sack again.
Yeah, and it follows this sort of argument, right? And the reason we would say that their identity really began to change between before 1204 and when Michael VIII, Paleologus, becomes the emperor of Byzantium again, is that they've lost these three pillars in one way or another, right? So they've lost their empire, and in a sense they've lost their emperor as well, because after the sack of 1204, there's now all these successor states. Nobody's really the emperor of Byzantium anymore. They're the emperor of their own small successor state, whether that be the Empire of Nicaea or the despotes of Epirus or the Trebizond or whatever it is, right? And so they've kind of lost their empire. They've lost their single emperor that is the sort of depiction of God himself and everything holy about Christianity in the world.
And then because the Catholics, those Catholics, are in control of Constantinople, they've also lost their religious orthodoxy.
Yeah, and along with that, they've essentially lost the only part of the pentarchy that they had at this point. Because centuries before, they'd already lost Antioch and Jerusalem and Alexandria, and they lost Rome to the Catholics, and so now they don't even have Constantinople anymore, and so they just don't have
There's
that
no
orthodoxy
weight behind.
Yeah, essentially. And because they've lost Constantinople, obviously, they don't have that connection either. And so Michael VIII Palaeologus really, and his predecessor just before, really started looking and redefining the Byzantine identity, because those three components of their identity are now gone.
They really needed a new outlook on how to view themselves.
Which essentially they found by relearning Hellenism
and that's
sort of
as I was saying earlier, there's just this immense rediscovery of Greek learning that they come to associate themselves more with the classical Greeks, which interestingly enough, when I think it's the Doge of Venice gifts them this land in the Peloponnese at Mistra, that is about a kilometre away from classical Sparta. So you kind of start seeing all these associations with this classical period of Sparta and Athens and Megara, the OG Byzantium. And they carve up this miniature empire in the Peloponnese as if they're Spartans.
Mm. I think what's very interesting, though, is that they do become more Greek, and they sort of flow towards that. And I think really the reason for that is because everybody calls them Greek, right? Because, consider they don't actually at this point have any ties with Greek necessarily, because the Emperor of Nicaea is in Anatolia.
But that's still the Greek heartland at the time.
It is, but I mean, they don't have sort of the Greek, cities of Sparta and things like that. And so I feel like this sort of push is more to do with the fact that now they don't really have any claim to be Roman, but everybody calls us Greek.
We might as well do what everyone else says.
For sure.
So yeah, that's it's a topic really that could be spoken about for ages.
Yeah.
We don't have the time or money to do decades worth of PhD research, busy people. But is there anything else that you want to conclude with, Matthew?
Just to say, if you made it this far, thank you for listening.
We're sorry.
We're sorry. We know we sound pretty terrible and all that kind of stuff. We're just, quite interested in these sort of topics and things like that. Feel free to sort of join in on the conversation in the comments and things like that if you want.
There will be a Facebook page and a YouTube page, the whole shabam.
Eventually.
Eventually.
We'll get there.
We'll get there.
Just
Technology's not our strong point, evidently.
The next 25 years or so, and we'll get there eventually.
So anyway, thank you for listening and hope to hear from you soon. Bye.